So, the final event in our 2022 International Screenwriters Lectures, the Doctor Who convention of screenwriting that imagines a weird and wonderful world in which screenwriters are invited to film festivals for their movies, where actors approach them tentatively on set and ask if they could change a beat or a pause, where directors invite them to the edit, and where chuckling executive producers throw an arm around their shoulders and say, "You're fired." No, I'm joking. Of course, we're all a happy family, and we are blessed to work in a vigorously sophisticated profession in which every smile that greets you has the double meaning of a Samuel Beckett play. Talking of plays, our next guest has written one of the greatest pieces of theatre in the 20th century. I read Angels in America before I saw it, and it took my breath away. I did then experience it in the theatre, and I was as mesmerised. It seemed impossible that a work so intimate could be so epic, that something so comic could be so tragic, and yet it was. As its author said of someone else's play, like most great works of dramatic art, it offered room for transformation while remaining its unmistakable self, which is just the most beautiful way to put it. This same playwright has gone on to work exclusively with the world's greatest film director, Steven Spielberg, writing the screenplays for Munich, Lincoln, West Side Story, and The Fabelmans. He is, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the world's foremost writers, and we are incredibly blessed and honoured to have him come and speak to us. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Tony Kushner.
Thank you, BAFTA, for inviting me to speak about screenwriting, a subject about which, upon the reflection occasioned by your invitation, I seem to know disturbingly little. I've been a screenwriter for 20 years, half of my writing life. I've written one miniseries based on a play of mine and 5 screenplays, 4 of which have been made into films. I've worked with only 2 film directors, one for the miniseries, one for the 4 films. Although I'm now comfortable being identified as a screenwriter, I consider myself a playwright who's learned to write screenplays, or perhaps I should say I'm a playwright who's learned to write screenplays for Steven Spielberg. The miniseries I mentioned, based on my play Angels in America, was directed by Mike Nichols, my other film director. I adored Mike. We became good friends, but we only worked together on the miniseries. After Angels aired, I started to write a screenplay about Eugene O'Neill that I hoped Mike would want to direct. I wrote half of the screenplay, and then I met Steven. Actually, I've worked with one other film director. Before Mike directed Angels, Robert Altman took a whack at it. He and I tried to find a way to make it into a film, but we couldn't. It wasn't exactly a surprise to me to discover that Bob was highly uninterested in figuring out scenes and solutions and then sticking with them. Each time we worked, we basically started over from the beginning. He'd throw out a lot of extraordinary ideas, and he was tickled by some of my ideas, but very little reached the point of solidity necessary to translate into script form, and the pages I produced seemed mainly to stimulate in Bob a new crop of what-ifs. Warren Beatty, who had worked with him on McCabe and Mrs. Miller, warned me that this condition of unfixity, manifestly central to the Altman aesthetic, would absolutely persist through filming and beyond, and if I didn't have the stomach for it, I should bail. Before I bailed, I got to see a 5-hour rough cut of short cuts, which remains one of the most extraordinary experiences I've ever had watching a film. I begged Bob not to cut any of it, but when you're known mostly for having written a 7.5-hour long play, no one pays attention when you say that some play or film is not too long. And I got to go to Paris with Bob, ostensibly to work with him on the Angels screenplay, while Bob did location scouting for his film Pret-a-Porter. We spent a couple of hours discussing how many penises my non-binary angel should have, and then I got to smoke pot in a Georges V hotel room with Bob, the jazz singer Annie Ross, and Anouk Aimée. I think that was probably the most glamorous thing I've ever done. In the end, we bailed on each other. Bob finally concluded that the problem was that Angels is written like a screenplay, with lots of short scenes and constantly changing locations. And that made it unusual for the stage, but Bob feared that when this screenplay, masquerading as a play, was filmed, it'd make, in his words, just another movie. I thought at the time he was possibly right. I'd been very excited about working with him because his movies, which I love a lot, invented a new kind of epic narrative, a new balancing of narrative's horizontal and vertical momentum. If Angels was in fact already a screenplay, if it was filmic, it was Altman-esque. Anyway, I decided Bob was right. Bob left and Mike came in, and almost right away Mike told me something that's made it possible for me to write screenplays. When I handed him the first draft of the first episode of Angels, after he'd read a few pages, he asked me how many films I'd worked on. I told him I'd never worked on a film. I'd never been on a film set. With exquisite tact, he said something like, "I can tell." And then he asked me to take the draft back and remove the POVs and boom shots and fade-ins and fade-outs with which I'd assiduously stuffed the script in the hope that I could convincingly impersonate a screenwriter. Mike suggested that I write in human language what I wanted the actors to say and do to try to describe the movie I'd like to watch. The rest would be up to him. That's in essence what I've tried to do with every screenplay ever since. I have an ambition to be a good screenwriter. I have no ambition to be a film director. But I love watching movies, and I find it helps me enormously to say to myself when I'm too intimidated and anxious to write a scene, which is pretty much every time I try to write a scene, that all I have to do really is pretend that I'm watching something that already exists and then describe it. That makes it sound like I write screenplays in a state of delirium, which isn't at all the case. The work I do, and I assume this is true of most writers, involves scrabbling and scribbling and tinkering and self-mortification and frustration on the way, if luck is with you, to finding something good. But I think it's true that one difference between playwriting and screenwriting is that screenwriting seems to require visualizing in a way that playwriting mostly doesn't, at least for me. When I write a play, I think this is true, images pop fitfully in and out of my head. But what I'm mostly conjuring are the faces of the actors I hope will play the roles I'm writing, or the faces of people on whom the characters are based. And my main concentration is the words on the page. I write plays with a fountain pen because the lines of a fountain pen are so expressive, and my scribbles and scratches on legal pads are entirely private, unshareable because largely illegible. When I'm screenwriting, I find that I'm following Mike's advice, working hard to imagine rooms, streets, battlefields, dances at high school gymnasiums, times of day and weather. And as I got more familiar with movie making, I even started trying to imagine where the camera might be placed, what that might add to the storytelling. That sounds like screenwriting for beginners, which is exactly what most of my career has been. Thanks to Mike, I still avoid writing POV. Back before I'd written any screenplay, I used to opine that films are more like novels than plays. I think what I meant is that narrative, a coherent, convincing fiction, is more at the heart of films and novels than plays, the heart of which is less narrative than dialectical. Plays tell stories, at least some do, same as films or novels, but the story on stage is more transparently, and perhaps more genuinely, a pretext for argument, for conflict. My subsequent experiences as a screenwriter have reassured me that I was onto something back then. Writing a screenplay certainly feels more like what I imagine writing a novel might feel like, something I know better than to ever attempt. Screenwriting feels denser than playwriting. So much more must be described. The words on the page of a screenplay need somehow to be more solidly descriptive. Maybe what I mean is that they need to be more readerly, more user-friendly than the words that compose the relatively spare skeletal pages of a play. Since I'm supposed to be talking about screenwriting, I won't take up more of your time puzzling over this difference between dialectical playwriting and novelistic screenwriting, which already screams for more refining and footnoting than anyone could possibly have patience to hear, and which, like everything I have to say about screenwriting, may refer exclusively to my subjective experience and have no larger significance. So I'll leave it alone, except only to say this. If it's true of the texts of plays since the Greeks, that their pages announce a lack, an absence of the performance and everything the performance will bring to what the reader is reading. If plays leave themselves vulnerable to interpretation in a way that screenplays don't. And I wonder if, in part, if this is true, it's true in part because playwrights know that what we write will, at least theoretically, outlast the interpretation and be as unaltered or altered by its realization as kinetic event as the playwright chooses. Whereas the screenplay perhaps betrays the screenwriter's anxiety, if not desperation, and here I'm speaking as a screenwriter who doesn't direct, over the awful finality that hovers over filmmaking, that hovers, for that matter, over the production processes of any inorganic commodity. The screenplay won't outlast its interpretation. It will be absorbed into the film its author has imagined. The German playwright Heiner Müller said that he wrote his plays for the dead. Screenwriters who don't direct have to write their plays for an audience of one, the film's director. Before I'd written any screenplays, I regarded screenwriting with a kind of horror, not because I felt in any regard superior to it, but because it seemed to me that screenwriting meant writing a cake recipe rather than baking a cake, or rather begging the baker to bake the cake in a certain way. I wasn't entirely wrong. As Marx admonished us, property relationships are defining, title, and shaping. Playwrights own their words and rent them out. Screenwriters don't. Years ago, I was doing a play at the National Theatre when a certain eminent British playwright sent the entire building into a state of red alert by threatening to pull the rights to a play of his currently on stage. Why, I thought to myself watching this, would anyone give up power like that? When I started screenwriting, I discovered a few reasons why. As Marx admonished us, you have to pay the rent, you need health insurance, and surrendering power is one way to arrange that. Brecht wrote that he despised anyone who couldn't use their brains to fill their belly, and while I shrink from its blanketing vitriol, I find what Brecht says usefully hortatory, something to get me out of bed in the morning and force me to my desk. I've also learned, since becoming a screenwriter, that I'm more a bottom than a top. A bossy bottom, to be sure, but a bottom. And I mean, I knew that about myself before I started writing screenplays, but I didn't realize that it was in some regard as true of me as an artist as it's true of me in other settings. Leaving aside the psychosexual I imagine to our collective relief, I discovered when I became a screenwriter that there's a genuine and meaningful relief attendant upon vacating the role of prime mover. I've always found writing of any sort very difficult, and while there is certainly exhilaration and permission that comes from having the final word, unless you're a sociopath, there's also heavy responsibility, an actual burden, the carrying of which may confine as much as or more than it liberates. This is only to say that there is strength and joy and other forms of freedom in community and collaboration, which brings into one's reach other forms of power. Of course, none of these benefits are likely to accrue unless one is, in fact, collaborating rather than simply submitting. I've learned that as a writer, as an artist, I can live with and even thrive by surrendering ultimate authorship, and I can make my democratic citizen soul accept power imbalances, even though I occasionally chaff at them, as long as I'm working with or for a person who's conscious of my independent subjective existence, whose relationship to authority is complex and competent, not fanatical, fetishistic, or infantile. As a screenwriter, I've been very lucky in the complex, competent film directors I've met, authorities or father figures or tops that I've worked with. Otherwise, I wouldn't be standing here calling myself a screenwriter. I'd remain exclusively a playwright and probably uninsured. It was my great good luck, sometimes I think it was beschert, which is a Yiddish word for destined, to write my first feature film screenplay for Steven Spielberg. Whether or not it was beschert, I think I can say after 4 films together, Steven and I have chemistry, another Yiddish word that means we work well together. And we continue to want to work together, although it's never been easy for him or for me. We fight a good deal. Actually, I fight. I don't like to fight, but I'm good at it, I think. And from the beginning of our collaboration, from the first draft of the screenplay till the day each film has been locked, I've argued with him, sometimes volubly, over any aspect of the screenplay or the film that resulted from it that seems to me worth fighting for. And after 19 years, I'm still astonished and deeply moved by this. Steven listens, and more than listens, he gets what collaboration can offer when the struggle is not over power, but the work at hand. He's the director, and he's Steven Spielberg, so he's going to win if I'm unable to convince him. There are instances of that in the movies we made, some of them significant. In some of those instances, I later decided that I was wrong and he was right, and there are some instances about which I remain convinced that he should have listened to me. On a very few occasions, he's done something he didn't really want to do just because I wanted it. But there are more moments in the films we've worked on together over which we struggled until one of us convinced the other. Or even better, when a new and better possibility that neither of us had envisioned was formed by our struggles. Of the 4 movies I've worked on with him, the first 3 were originally proposed by Steven. Munich and West Side Story were rewrites of existing scripts, though I was given carte blanche in writing the first draft of each to make any changes I wanted. Stephen doesn't make the mistake of imagining he can get the script he wants by attempting to control in advance the scope and direction of a writer's skills and talents. He actually loves writing, words, screenplays. He's wonderfully out of step with an industry in which writers are often treated as a necessary nuisance and/or an unnecessary expense. Stephen loves being surprised. When he asked me to write Munich, I told him that I didn't know if I could do it. I didn't know how to write a screenplay. And I asked if I could write some sample scenes first. He said yes, but unhelpfully he refused to tell me when I asked him to do so what scenes I should write. So perhaps because I wanted to test him, I wrote a dream sequence in which the lead character, the Mossad agent Avner, dreams he's interrogating a Palestinian prisoner. I think I thought that if a dream scene didn't make Stephen run away, maybe we could work together. Stephen loved the scene, and it wound up in Munich, though not as a dream sequence. I demurred again when Stephen asked me to write Lincoln, which was based on Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals, an 800-page, four-way political biography centered around one of the most studied, most extraordinary human beings who ever lived, set in the American Civil War, at the time the bloodiest war in recorded history and the turning point of the American democratic experiment, or I should say the first turning point. We're currently in our second. I spent 2 years researching, all of which was thrilling, some of which was useful, and some was just a way of maintaining self-respect while frantically avoiding trying to write the script, which I was sure was going to be completely impossible. I wrote several drafts, each starting in September 1863, intending to get to Lincoln's assassination in April 1864, and I abandoned each draft after I'd written over 100 pages, and I could never manage to get past November of 1863. Eventually, I realized that in the last 4 months of his administration, the main themes of Lincoln's life and political career were dramatically in evidence, and I proposed to Stephen that I focus on that. I showed him an 18-page outline, and he said nervously, "That still seems like a lot of ground to cover." But he wished me good luck, and a few months later, I handed in a draft that covered the last 4 months of Lincoln's administration. It was 500 pages long. I was sure that I was going to get fired, and if not, I was sure Stephen would be most attracted to the final month when Lincoln went down to Petersburg, Virginia to visit General Grant and the Union soldiers and was thence present at the collapse of the Confederacy. Without question, this is one of the most overtly powerful, dramatic moments in American history. In the email accompanying my 500-page script, after apologizing for the insane length, I asked Stephen not to rush through the less dramatic event that I'd written about in the month of January 1864, when Lincoln got the lame duck House of Representatives to pass the 13th Amendment. It's an understatement to say that I was surprised when, a few hours after I had emailed him the script, I received this photograph via email. So he's smiling, and you can see he's at the very beginning of the script. And then a few hours later, I got this photograph. And he's still smiling, and he's almost done. I'm including these two photographs because I felt bad and playwriterly not to show film clips like many of the other screenwriter lecturers have done. So this is my concession to the form. Thank you very much. Okay, he can go away. According to a plaque out there, he paid for the projection booth. So this is all we're completing a circle. Then even more surprising, a phone call came a few hours after that, in which Stephen said that the House vote on the 13th Amendment was his favorite part of the script. And eventually, he decided, and I happily concurred, that that would be the entirety of the film. When I originally said no to writing Lincoln, which I said over and over for 6 months before saying yes, one of my many concerns was that I was unsure about the value of a movie about our democracy surviving a crisis because a statesman of real intellectual, moral, and political genius improbably appeared in time to save it. I don't think that's hyperbolic. Lincoln alone didn't save democracy. He didn't end American slavery alone. Some would say he didn't succeed in ending American slavery. But even if they're right about that, inarguably, he helped to end it, arguably more than any other single individual. As one of his secretaries, John Hay, said of him after his death, "If democracy is the American secular religion, Lincoln is its Christ." But the problem with being rescued by a hero is what happens when you're in trouble and there are no heroes. We certainly can't place our hopes for survival on an Abraham Lincoln magically appearing. I didn't realize it at the time that Stephen said he wanted to make the entire movie about a vote in the House of Representatives. But in doing so, Stephen solved my conundrum. He made the House of Representatives not the first thing to come to mind when one thinks of the word hero, along with Lincoln, the film's protagonist. It was a perfectly democratic dramaturgical solution from a profoundly small and big D democratic artist. The Fabelmans was, in a certain sense, my idea, or anyway, I pushed Stephen to make it, even though it's his story. I'd never written a script with anyone before I co-wrote the screenplay with him. And it was the most enjoyable time I've had writing anything. The movie feels like a culmination of our 19 years of work together. When you collaborate, you begin with a kind of double imaginary of the work you hope you're going to make and of your collaborator or collaborators, their minds and their imaginations, by which, in consonance and dissonance with your own, an intimate melding becomes possible. I guess what I'm saying is that before I started co-writing the character of Sammy Fabelman, I spent 19 years writing screenplays for an imaginary character called Steven Spielberg, as well as for the real Spielberg, who sometimes cooperates with and sometimes defies my imagining, which keeps the work interesting. I'm currently at work on 2 screenplays that aren't for Steven. There's no director attached. I'm in control for now, and that's making the writing, well, honestly, a little too open-ended for comfort. Not that I ever expect writing to be comfortable. In fact, if I feel comfortable writing anything, I feel like I'm failing, like I'm more of a fake than the fake I usually feel I am. But I miss having another artist in whose vision I'm participating, another artist to challenge and be challenged by. And I'm thinking about all those second Banana solo albums after the group splits up. I haven't split up with Stephen. I'm discussing a new project with him, but you know what I mean. Being a screenwriter has been at times ego-battering, but I've gotten to make 4 movies with a great director, 4 movies that seem to me of a piece with the work that I've done in the theater and hope to keep doing in the theater. I hope to help create entertainment that provides deep kinds of pleasure, as deep as I'm capable of getting, maneuvering around and making salutary use of my many limitations as an artist, a thinker, a citizen, and a man, and perhaps in the process reorganizing those limitations through the understanding that my dreaming and working lives supply. So that's what I have to say. It's too long, and I wrote it all at the last minute, which is basically my writing career in a nutshell. Thank you.